which is really exciting. Um, and then we'll go to the next slide. So we are going to be recording this webinar. If you need to access it, it's going to be available on luminary.works website. So that'll be posted within 48 hours. If you want to go back or if you'd like to share it within your network, we're happy to see you do that. So it will be available over there. We are going to have a panel discussion today that'll last about 45 minutes, and then we're going to leave the last 15 minutes or so of our webinar for questions and answer period. So during the presentation, if anything comes up, you can either take note of it, throw it in the chat, or wait till the end so that you can have an opportunity to engage with the panelists and ask your questions to them. Next slide. So we want to take a minute just to center ourselves and welcome you all and do our land acknowledgement. So Luminary acknowledges that we are gathering from many Indigenous territories across Turtle Island, and we would like to invite each of you to learn about whose land you're on and joining us from and share that in the chat if you're comfortable. So for me, myself, I am Terry Lynn Morrison, Executive Director at Luminary. I am joining today from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe here in Ottawa, where I am a guest. And yeah, so welcome. And we will introduce our panel next. Oh, actually, before that, we do want to have a thank you to our partners who contributed funding to support Luminary. So we are funded by the Government of Canada through the Innovation, Science and Economic Development Strategic Science Fund. That funding envelope is available to us from 2024 to 2029. And we also receive support from RBC, who has been a partner with us since this year or for the next 2 years. So we're really happy to have that. And we also have our academic members who contribute as well to keeping us going here and to be able to deliver these programs and services to communities. Now we'll introduce the panelists. So today I have the great privilege of engaging in conversation with three leaders in the seaweed industry. I have Mark Smith with us, who is the executive director from the Pacific Seaweed Industry Association. We also have Rihanna Nagel. We didn't practice the last name, sorry.
Nagel like
Who
bagel.
Nagel, all right, Nagel like bagel, who is the manager for the Center for Applied Research and Technology and Innovation at North Island College out in BC. And we also have Isla Brown, who is the board chair of the Health-Sick Climate Action Team. She's stepping in for Desiree, who was supposed to be on the panel, but had to travel today. So we're really, really thankful to have Isla joining us and stepping in to share some of the great work that her community is doing. And I'd like to also take a minute just to turn it over to Craig Hall, who is joining us. He's a VP over at Luminary and also part of Indigenous Works and has been very active on the seaweed file. And he's going to give a little bit of a history and background on the partnership that Luminary has with Pacific Seaweed. So, Craig, over to you.
Thank you, Terry Lynn, and thanks for joining us, everyone. And we're looking forward to this panel discussion this afternoon because we've been doing a lot of very, very interesting work on seaweed through different roundtables, so far just on the West Coast, but the plan is to do work as well on the East Coast and potentially up in Nunavut to really explore what a plan, an industry or sectoral plan could look like for the an Indigenous seaweed sector in Canada. It's, as Mark will tell you from the Pacific Seaweed Association, it's a growing industry globally. And Canada is fortunate in having, I think, over 530 different species of seaweed on both coasts. It's and Our industry is actually not very well developed. So it's a great opportunity to get involved in the sector. We have some great partnerships with the Pacific Seaweed Association and North Island College. We've been doing a lot of work together, gradually building out a plan. We were fortunate to receive some funds for this work from Connell Foundation that enabled the roundtables to take place and for the research. And so we've been marching along. gathering a lot of interesting opinions. The last workshop that we held very quickly here was in October in Nanaimo, and really it focused on the value chain. So we traditionally think of commercial opportunities happening in the coast, but as you move more towards the value added aspects of seaweed, increasingly some of those can take place and be developed inland as well. So it's a very interesting sector that could grow and have very beneficial consequences and benefits for Indigenous people right across the country. So very exciting. Very happy to be here today and to listen to our panelists and take part in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. I think that that's really interesting to hear that there's 530 seaweed species in Canada. Like just being new to this space, and learning, the different, and we'll get into that with the panelists who have so much to share about the seaweed. But yeah, that's interesting. And then also the value chain, thinking about that transformation and the value add potential, because it's one thing to harvest a resource, but we do also recognize that there is a lot of value when you transform these raw materials. So I'm curious to hear from the panelists, in that context as we get into the conversation. So without further ado, let's get into the first question. So I'm going to call on Rihanna and then Mark and then Isla. And my first question is really wanting to hear about, the lens of your lens on the opportunity. So if you could each, give a quick introduction to yourselves and then share the perspective you bring, whether from community, leadership, research, policy, business, or industry, and describe how you see the emerging seaweed sector becoming an opportunity not just for coastal nations, but for communities across Canada. So open it up to you, Rihanna.
Great. Hi, everyone. Really nice to be here today. Thanks to Indigenous Works for hosting. I am calling in today from Lac-Ouiattach territory in Campbell River. So specifically the territory of the Wewakai, Wewakam, and Quyakat First Nations. And I live on Denman Island, which is an island southeast of Courtney on Vancouver, just off of Vancouver Island, Comox territory. I have three kids, and I feel very fortunate to live where I live and be able to be close to the sea and all of the wonderful seaweeds that come up on the coast every morning when I walk down to the beach and see what's new that morning of what the waves brought in. Um, and it's really quite wonderful to think of the long history of connection with the sea and with the seaweeds and all of the all of the abundance around us. Um, in my work life, I am the manager of the Center for Applied Research Technology and Innovation at North Island College, which serves the northern part of Vancouver Island and up the central coast. Um, Within that work, we have a seaweed innovation hub, which I've really been enjoying supporting the researchers and partners in diving into some pretty interesting applied research and innovation projects together. The focus of our hub is to bring together questions from community with research expertise and equipment needed to respond to those questions and to really support people in finding answers to things that are coming up for them and everything related to seaweed. And who those people are is diverse. We work with a number of different First Nations up and down the coast, as well as industry partners and community organizations. And within this, we really do span quite a spectrum of interests in the seaweed sector, everything from producing little seeds to be able to plant seaweed out either for restoration or cultivation, to creating how to create products from the various seaweed species. And of course, as a community college, we have a really strong focus on capacity building and really serving the community around us to support community well-being and community economic development. I think in terms of how I see this emerging sector, I see that there, as an emerging sector at this moment that is tied to resources on our coast, I think the big opportunity is learning from the past experiences we've had in resource extractive sectors on our coasts. Um, and I think that means that we're learning how and we're embedding within this sector. I really feel that in the work that I do with the different partners that we work with. I feel a really strong intention towards Indigenous leadership in the sector. I and as well as um, within that, a commitment to not taking resources from coastal communities and making profit from those resources elsewhere, but really focusing on how the sector can support the coastal communities and be a part of coastal communities. In some cases, as was mentioned, that will be processing somewhere on the prairies, which is awesome, and that's a whole part of the sector and what have you. But all of that being done in an equitable way, and a just way. So I see that as a really big opportunity for this sector. Um, And within that, I also see in terms of that learning that there's so much capacity on our coasts, knowing how to be on the water, knowing how to tie knots, knowing how to, all the canneries that we have, all the infrastructure that's there to support processing and what have you. There is a huge abundance of capacity, whether it be physical resources or human capacity, and knowledge, both traditional and scientific, and melding those together. And that I think is really how I see where we're at right now, but we're really at a very emerging stage of the sector. So on the slide there, you'll see some of the current projects that we work on as a seaweed innovation hub. And as an emerging sector, the questions are never ending right now. So that's fun. Anyways, that's sort of where I'm at right now and the lens I'm bringing to this conversation. And I look forward to hearing from Mark and then Nyla.
Perfect.
Great. Thanks, Rihanna. It's fantastic. Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon, I guess, for most of you on the other side of the country. And I wanted to say, again, thank you to Indigenous Works and the Luminary Project Initiative for facilitating that. That's great. So my name is Mark Smith. I lead the executive or the Pacific Seaweed Industry Association, and we are chartered as a nonprofit organization in British Columbia. And we are certainly, the majority of our work has and is very focused in the province of British Columbia. But you will notice that our name is the Pacific Association. So we're very British Columbia centric, but we're not the British Columbia Association. We're not the Pacific Northwest. We're the Pacific. I have a great friend at the organization of Oceanwise, and I always borrow with pride his commentary, and that is that whales don't carry passports. And I think that's important here, that the waters here, we have lots of opportunity. So what do? We really work. So, and I have to back up for a second. I apologize. I'm joining you today from Victoria on the lands of the Songhees, Lekwungen, and Wasonic people. So I apologize, I missed that at the beginning, but thank you again. And I'm in Victoria on the West Coast. But organizationally, we work at the intersection of ocean health, social and community license, and economic development. And as the industry association on this call, that might sound a little backwards that the economic development piece is at the background, at the back end. The reality is we firmly believe and are working toward that if we don't get all of those other pieces right, we firmly believe that there will not actually be an opportunity. So it's mission critical. And as Rihanna articulated, the industry is very much at the onset and at the beginning. Therefore, and again, this is not new, but it's emerging at a larger scale. But the opportunity from where I'm sitting early on is philosophically, I believe that rarely in time do we get the opportunity to have all of the conversations with all of the groups, all the potential organizations, stakeholders, nations at the beginning, and everybody can co-create this. So we're not managing anything. We're here. We do a lot of listening. We're thrilled to be working with our friends at Indigenous Works in a lot of these conversations and some of these sessions that Craig's alluded to that we've started to embark upon and co-facilitate across the country are really just that. What are the opportunities and where we go? But that said, over and above, yes, we're at the beginning. I see monumental opportunity. Outside of Craig's commentary on species, lots of thousands of species globally in the seaweed space. Longest coastlines in the world belong to Canada. We should be a leader in this industry. British Columbia, the East Coast, certainly the Arctic, there's lots of things that are afoot there that are starting to happen. So that's interesting. And through our work, the other thing that we have done, which I invite you all to have a look at, is we have created what we call the Canadian Seaweed Industry Network. And that's what it is. It's a network. It's a place to start conversations. We've launched a student network, so we're starting to engage in conversations there. And when we started having conversations in other areas of the country, and not just the coastlines, including, as Rihanna quickly identified, some of those, we're having very interesting people in the prairie provinces. And I can assure you, when you're talking to somebody in Winnipeg, Manitoba, they kind of look at you a little odd the first time you mention seaweed. But that said, when we embarked on national conversations, we quickly learned that lots of regional nuances in different areas. But the reality is across Canada, and what we've learned is that not just is there a big opportunity, a lot of the infrastructure that we need to make this industry happen already exists. Do we have boats? Do we have shoreside services? Do you have folks that have worked on the water for generations that understand a lot of these things with very transferable skills? So it's not a huge stretch. So I think that opportunity to all get together, look at all the opportunities, of which the food security focus on this call is a key piece. We can all get together and get this moving. I think there's an appetite with the government currently to see this industry succeed. We should be, as an Indigenous-led industry in this country, have the ability to create a global template of how this industry should be done. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mark. Now over to Isla.
Yo, hello everyone. I'm at home in the Helsta Kwahuisau. Our traditional territories are up in the central coast of British Columbia. I'm the chair of our Helsa Climate Action Board of Directors. And Helsa Climate Action is involved in a number of different seaweed projects, one with Rihanna at NIC. We're looking at kelp gardening and restoration projects. We're also involved in the expansion of an enhancement around pyropia, or ust is how we say it in our language. And for us, this really isn't a new or emerging industry as the world sees it, but it's a continuation of a millennia-old economy and relationship with seaweed. For the Healthstuck, we've been trading in seaweed for thousands of years. It's abundant in our territory. It's well known on the coast as like Celtic black gold, because we traded so prolifically with our coastal neighbors down on Vancouver Island and up in the north for Gleitna, Ooligan grease, because we don't have an Ooligan River, but we have a lot of seaweed, and specifically pyropia, or red laver as it's called. And so we have a really long tradition of trading, of seaweed being a trade commodity for us. And so we have like a vast and long-standing knowledge around how to manage and abundance in terms of seaweed. And so we really are coming to this from a perspective of a well-established quotations industry. And, our perspective is really grounded in title and rights, in protection of the environment. Our mandate to do seaweed work comes from our community energy plan, where Celtic people identified food sovereignty as the number one important factor and piece to work on in regards to climate change. Because as land-based, ocean-based peoples, we're first impacted, and our guardians are already tracking changes in seaweed and notifying the scientists. So we have a deep relationship with seaweed and have for a very long time, for, hundreds of generations. And so, we really, in terms of, getting to talk to everyone, as that we really see our role as like building a table that doesn't look like anything, because even though seaweed is a biomass commodity, we've seen over and over again biomass collapse on the coast when we go into that gold rush extraction. And so, like, we held a symposium this summer, the Health Six Seaweed Symposium, and invited the scientists, the people from industry, the people from traditional Indigenous governance, and had a holistic conversation about how do we move forward in a way that's in line with our goilos, our traditional knowledge. And so we have commercial partners that we're looking at expanding our um, pyropia harvest into more of a commercial harvest, but we also like brought in key decision makers and environmentalists, and we're partnering around like how do we sustainably scale up something that has already existed as a trade commodity for us. So, I think that this opportunity has the opportunity, or this industry has the opportunity to be like quite different in setting a pathway for us as a nation, where we're not going into like a staples economy and extracting, but really building something that is different, because we have, for the first time, have, in this era of reconciliation, invited a completely different perspective into the room, and we're not looking at extraction in the same way. And so it really excites me, and I see that the opportunity is there around seaweed. And also, I don't know if everyone knows this, but it's seaweed produces like 70 to 80% of the world's oxygen. And it is like those kelp forests are more efficient than rainforests. And I come from a rainforest, but like we are talking about a hugely important ecosystem as well. And for us, like, the sea otters, the kelp forest, it's all intertwined. And we have that traditional ecological knowledge, and we work with scientists. So like our kelp gardening projects are just as important as our commercial projects. So I think we're at a beginning part for everyone else, but that as Indigenous people, as place-based people, we have a lot to bring to the table and are looking to form this new opportunity in the likeness of our ancestors' abundance.
That is amazing. I think that, what really resonated with me from all three of you speaking, I hear that there is that connection that already exists to, the seaweed and the relationship that we have with the seaweed and everything around that whole ecosystem. But on the other side, it's like the infrastructure is already there. We have the boats, we have the knowledge, we have the experience that's required to be able to put these governance models in place to make sure that this is done in a good way so that the industry is sustained, where, we are learning from the past and we're not just being extractive. And I think that what's really key is the whole idea about it being, an equitable sector, but actually having leadership from First Nation, from Indigenous communities for the first, like one of the first times. There's a real opportunity here to shape, and I've heard, that we have an opportunity to make a global template in terms of how things can and should be done in a good way. So yeah, it just gets me really excited to hear about that, because oftentimes the story isn't that, right? And this is a real opportunity to shape that narrative and to show how Indigenous knowledge and leadership and wisdom can really benefit an industry in a way that hasn't been done before. So, kudos to you all for like taking up that space. So we will go to the next question, and kind of building off of what you just spoke about in terms of capacity, like Canada's potential versus the world. Like when you look at a global seaweed leaders like Norway, Alaska, Japan, Korea, like what really stands out to you about where Canada currently sits? I know we heard that Canada has the largest amount of like coastline. But like, what else are Canada's natural advantages, and what must we do to compete, scale, and lead internationally? You may have already touched on it a bit, but just want to dig a little bit deeper into that from each of you. So we'll start. We'll flip it if that's okay. We'll go Mark, Isla, and then Rihanna.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I see so significant first and foremost, many advantages. But I think the real advantage that Canada has is, and I've alluded to that around the coastlines, which is really a physical piece. It's also, and kind of hearkening back to our connectivity as the Pacific, when you talk about the Alaska or the Japans and the Koreas and really the Asian market in general, very mature markets, um, good, bad, or indifferent. The majority of seaweed that's being used, certainly in Canada and North America in general, probably over 90% of that is imported into inputs. So that whole opportunity is, I think the carbon footprint alone of being able to produce and generate our own products into our own market before we look at other larger opportunities is mission critical. I think part of this, and I'm not going to go too far down the road around kind of the carbon footprint of the climate piece is, but early on, even if we were working with the Alaskas of the world, the Washingtons, Californias, Oregons, Mexico, up and down that coast, we're a little more geographic centric to be able to leverage those opportunities. The other piece is Canada, we really lead in innovation in general. And as Isla's kind of mentioned you around that kind of that biomass piece around how much are we going to grow and what do we ultimately want to do with the seaweed that's either wild grown or farm grown, whatever the output is that we can lead in some of the innovation and things like they're doing at North Island College, and where we're working collaboratively on, are there other techniques that we can be using? Can we be learning from some of those traditional drying techniques, hypothetically, and all those other pieces? Canada should be out in front of all those things in doing some of those things that we do best. We organizationally, we've been working to build bridges with a lot into the European markets and that where they are very similar. I know when I started doing this work, I made all these assumptions that I thought all these countries were miles ahead of us. And then we get over there only to find that we're all really about the same place. So that's important. It's also incredibly noteworthy that back to that community piece, that whole area of opportunity, again, not just on the coastal communities, but all across the country through innovation, education, the ties into traditional agriculture that seaweed brings, whether it's in terms of a fertilizer or other productions. There's a big global movement for seaweed grown on land. So it might be surprising to some of you to learn that some of the biggest production facilities of seaweed in North America are in the middle of Arizona in the desert. True story. So there's lots of opportunities, and not to hijack the whole conversation, we get excited around the piece of, our natural advantages, our positioning here. When we talk to organizations around the world, Canada, as we all know, is a great brand. And I hate to sound like the corporate guy, but there's a whole cachet around the quality in our waters and the harvest that we're generating. So there might be opportunities there. So again, significant putting all those pieces together. And I will continue to say that opportunity to really create that template. And even part of that might be until we get to the industry, and I'll use that term loosely, we're not quite sure what the industry looks like. That ocean health, reforestation, climate change, those things are mission critical to turning the, no pun intended, turning the tide on all of these overall objectives we've got. So I could go on forever on my, as I like to call it, my seaweed soapbox, but I just think we're incredibly well positioned to go out. And we're learning that really in the context outside of these other countries. People are looking at Canada. So let's try and leverage that opportunity.
Thank you. Over to you, Rihanna.
Oh, Isla, did you want to go next? Because I think that was the original plan.
Oh,
Do you have
sorry.
something burning?
It's okay. Go ahead, Rihanna.
Well, I was actually one of the things that I was thinking about for this question um, is related to something that I think you have a lot to say about, Isla. So I'm curious to sort of build on this, but I think one of the um, like one place where Canada stands apart is all of these, and I know this is in other places too, but Um, but I do see it as a really strong strength, and you alluded to this earlier, Isla, is those trade relationships between nations and those trade pathways and those economies that have been here for a long time, and in some cases are broken, but in some cases are still strong, and what those look like, and how that is different in terms of supporting thriving communities and true like community well-being as opposed to necessarily um, yeah, I think that it just fits within maybe perhaps a more equitable and ecologically sound and culturally sound economic approach. So I think that's really exciting. So I'd love to hear what you have to say about that, Isla. And then I'm also another thing that I think stands out, and Mark, you talked about this, is like Canada's identity, and one of our identities, even though in some cases it's false, but we do have a strong stewardship identity, and ecological care identity. And I think that that does put a product of seaweed that comes out from Canada in a little bit of a different place than products of seaweed that might come out from coasts who countries that have track records of really a lot of ecological damage on their coasts. And again, that's the identity. It's not necessarily the reality, but that is the identity. Um, yeah, and what we talked about earlier with just lots of the aquaculture, marine, and food and beverage capacity across the nation and what that means. Um, yeah, what are your thoughts, Isla?
Yeah, I think that you're right. Like our existing high value trade, indigenous trade system is an advantage because like sometimes we forget that Canada already has a premium seaweed economy. You know, our indigenous pyropia trade, it's high value, sustainable, and governed by strict protocols. And that is the standard we should be scaling is high quality, values driven, and rooted in deep relationships. You know, our loss determines that kelp isn't a resource, it's a relative. You know, Rihanna would have heard about this at our Health Kelp Symposium. We talked about it as a teacher and a relative. And that's not just some poetic mumbo jumbo. You know, it's a distinct economic model. Like treating the resource as kin ensures long-term viability and sustainability in a way that extractive industries can't. And I really see our loss and our traditional governance systems and also the Canadian legal framework around rights with the shift towards UNDRIP and all of this as an advantage because it gives us that competitive piece where we don't just manage our resources, we have deep legal obligations to them as Indigenous people. And when we acknowledge plural jurisdiction, we can manage resources in ways that will ensure longevity far into the future. And I really see that as a natural advantage for Canada because in places, you know, of course, coastline and the pristine coastline, you know, image we have are great. But I really see a lot of strength in our Indigenous legal systems and the values that they place on trade and harvesting as like a way to make sure that as this industry grows, it's in a sustainable way that also I really want to remind people have this image that's been put in their head through the Canadian media of like Indigenous people being against industry and there's this or they're sellouts or this and that. But really, especially on the coast, especially around like trade, we cultivated abundance and beautiful, blooming, booming economies, like represented in our potlatch system, where you gave away as much as you could because that's how rich you were. And so I really think that that abundance model, with the strict protocols and relationship-based management, is our advantage in this case.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's going to lead really well into the next question that I have for you all. And, just again, like there's such a huge opportunity there and the natural advantage and like the opportunity to lead in innovation really interests me as well. And I think that we haven't talked about this, but like the uses of seaweed and what is the potential there. I know that Isla and I were having a conversation before this webinar, and she was talking to me about the health benefits of seaweed and what that brings. So, thinking about that in terms of an innovation package and how do we position this product to be top quality and, serving a variety of needs and purposes and helping people live better. So I think that that's really interesting. But I just want to jump right into the next question because I'm going to start with Isla on this one, and it's about building a national Indigenous-led industry. And not to take it in a negative context, but I think, we need to think about, and we'd like to learn about here at Luminary, and I'm sure the participants on the call as well, is that, what would it take to build a strong Indigenous-led seaweed sector across Canada? We know that this exists in pockets, like definitely the work that's happening in Healtsick and a lot of other coastal communities, I'm sure, as well in the Pacific, but thinking, more broadly, an Indigenous-led seaweed sector across Canada where we're involved in all aspects of the value chain from coastal communities straight into the prairies, from the Atlantic to the Arctic. So, what are the biggest gaps that we need to close to unlock the national potential? And, like I said, I'll start with Isla to hear what you think are, some of the areas that we can support in terms of building that knowledge and capacity for others that aren't as familiar with the opportunity that could exist for communities. And then we'll go to Mark and finish up with Rihanna.
Yeah, I think that for this, like the one of the biggest gaps that obviously exist as like an emerging industry is infrastructure. So like we need investment in community-owned processing and labs. Like what some people maybe don't know is like we haven't even closed the life cycle on pyropia. And a lot of the traditional knowledge actually held into that. So like a harvesting practice is to pull off the end of the seaweed when you're harvesting it. And turns out that's where like the reproductive parts are in pyropia, but that wasn't known prior to like the indigenous knowledge and harvesting practices. And so like really we do need to like the ability to have like our own processing and labs and also to convert existing infrastructure that was focused on fish and other kind of into processing capacity for seaweed. So if we're making a shift, there is a lot of infrastructure on the coast, but it's geared into other industries and it's sitting vacant because the fisheries have all collapsed. So I think like, repurposing that existing infrastructure in for seaweed, and we can't like just be suppliers of raw biomass. Like that's not sustainable. That when I was speaking earlier around that gold rush mentality, like we need to move as a national sector beyond that. And, we don't want to take care of this biomass for someone else. It needs to be for us. So that value added is so critical. Let's not just be seaweed harvesters and processors. Let's process it into an actual product. And, we have to hold the jurisdiction and value added processing within our communities. And Indigenous communities live out here on the coast. I'm on an island in the middle of nowhere right now. Like we are the folks who have the capacity, who've been fishing here, who've been cultivating abundance, who have the boats, who can do this work. And I think that place-based industry and economies really make our people feel have like they have meaningful purpose and roles when they're working in them too. And we also need to recognize and remove barriers because there are barriers right now, like in the existing trade of pyropia, that our traditional harvesters can't sell that. It's, for food, social, ceremonial only, which is like that's how we're trading it in large quantities, really large quantities in some cases. But like removing those economic barriers to let people participate, Indigenous folks participate in the, free market economy because those barriers do exist. So I think like infrastructure is key, removing those structural barriers that exist to traditional harvesters already, and really digging into that like reciprocity over extraction, which we've all already talked about.
Great.
I'm gonna jump in there, and I couldn't agree more with everything Isla just said, but I would add some of those gaps. Exactly, we know that some of those infrastructure pieces are there, but looking around things like processing, that's where selfishly we see a role to help develop some of those things, i.e. the processing. Who's going to own that? Don't know the answer to any of that question yet, but I mean, it might start as a small co-op model. We don't know any of those things. But that said, all of these opportunities and relationships, all of those things need to happen. Are there shuttered fish plants up and down the west coast of British Columbia? Absolutely, that could be repurposed into a drying facility, for example. For sure, those things are key. And I think some of those, the whole piece that excites me is that all the way through the value add, just not being the harvesters, but being the processors and developing those product paths. I think it's also noteworthy that the kind of the vision around this of, and there's movements afoot predominantly in the fishing space around what they call 100% usage. Like, how do we use all the fish? Same thing with seaweed. We could be processing it and product opportunities, whether it's into a cosmetic product, construction material, textiles, clothing, whole host of opportunities. There's not a week that goes by and I spend a lot of time fully immersed in the seaweed space that I don't have a conversation with somebody and go, "You're doing what with seaweed?" That's fascinating. So all of these opportunities for sure are there to be developed. I suspect there's a whole host of things we don't know what we don't know yet. But by coming together and addressing some of those gaps, i.e., the processing, which is mission critical to getting some of those things going, and it needs to be closer to the dock. It needs to be closer to the nations. That makes perfect sense. Working on the water, all of those skills that already exist need to be there. Some of those other pieces, though, are from the industry side. If we're developing a product, like, well, who's the customer? We need to get those customers looking. We need to do education around the uses of that seaweed, right? And that starts with all the way back into the schools. How do we educate and lead all of these pieces? And again, I think all of the expertise that already exists, not just in British Columbia, but across the country and all these in these rural communities, is significant. So that's the great news, is that most of that, again, is here. And the starting point is, where do we start? And I think by this, I'm going to call it this collaborative approach, is mission critical. We all have to get together and solve, because the other, unfortunately, the business perspective of this is the money and funding is going to have to come from somewhere. So what role can the government play? And if we all get together, how can we leverage some of those opportunities to support and drive that growth forward? So I know that there's monumental opportunities to lead from the front. I think the first and foremost biggest takeaway for me is we need to have a lot more discussions like this to keep things moving forward.
I really appreciate what both of you are saying there. Um, and lots of different things come to mind. In our work at the Seaweed Innovation Hub, we partner and connect with so many different individuals and nations and businesses and organizations who are really, at the end of the day, trying to solve some sort of problem or question that they have, or trying to bring some like amazing innovative idea to reality. And so in terms of like, what are the gaps and what do we need to build there, it's quite broad and it's quite deep. I think we need both breadth and depth of like there's a breadth and a depth of gaps to be filled. um I think in terms of these conversations, Mark, I totally agree. And I think having those focused conversations and really caring and connected conversations like Healthsick hosted this summer. Little plug for our conference, our summit this spring, May 6th to 8th. North Island College, along with the Pacific Seaweed Industry Association and Healthsick Climate Action Team, and We Become First Nation are hosting a Pacific Seaweed Summit to continue these conversations. Here in Campbell River. Really looking forward to that opportunity and more opportunities like this. And that, I think that is crucial. I think that collaboration piece is crucial. We can't be competing to all solve the same idea at the same time. If we all have the same question or the same idea, let's work together to bring that forward. In terms of infrastructure, I totally see that. And I see there's opportunity to have the value added product, but it requires the related processing infrastructure. We currently have one of our team members has a business focus in his work, and he's looking at a number of market analyses, one of which will look at some of the key species on our coast here in British Columbia and identify some of the like high potential for economic return for different products. But factoring in the context of our coast, the the cultural, social, economic, and ecological context of our coast. And so I'm looking forward to the outcomes of that. I think more information about so that people, when they start, they have an idea and they might be like, oh, I want to make a shirt out of seaweed. That's a very broad idea. So what seaweed? From where? Who's going to grow it? What do you, there's lots of questions there. I think I'll leave it there. I think there's a lot of capacity that's already there, but I think creating models of mentorship where people who have that capacity can share the capacity is also really important. Um, and that again comes from those reciprocal relationships and the reciprocity and economy that Isla was talking about, because then you're sharing not just this product that's going back and forth, but you're sharing knowledge and skills as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think that that's really interesting in terms of that knowledge, the knowledge networks that need to be created to be able to, I'm just thinking about it from my perspective coming from the East Coast and being a coastal community, really tied up in fisheries, but where seaweed is not as predominantly known, talked about, or used in this spaces back home. So I think, really understanding what the opportunity is. And like you said, if you want to build a if you want to, build a t-shirt out of seaweed, like what kind of seaweed, who's going to grow, like all of those things that you wouldn't even consider, right? Because when I think seaweed, I think piece of seaweed, but really it's more complex than that. And there's so much more, to learn about, these 530 species that exist and what the different value adds could be for each of them. And, even the state of certain species, I'm sure some are more compromised than others. And how do we ensure that they're available for the next 7 generations? To come, because from an Indigenous context, that's what we're always thinking about, is how can we ensure that the next 7 generations coming behind us are able to benefit off the resources that we do now. And when we think about our fishery industry and how that's depleted and how that has changed the way that, Indigenous communities are living off their land and feeding their communities and taking care of one another. And we don't want to see that happening in the future. So this seaweed model that we're talking about and discussing and exploring, I think really, building off of the lessons of the past and looking forward to that type of legacy that we want to leave behind is really important. So absolutely more conversations like this. I'm so happy to have had the chance to hear from you all today and hope to keep this going. I'm gonna go over to the audience in a minute or so just to see if there's any specific questions for any of our panelists. I noticed that the chat is a little quiet today, which is fine. I know the holidays are coming up, but there's one question in there, and it's from Rihanna to Isla. So I can just ask it. It was just a question about the co-op. Is it led by HRMD or HCAT? Maybe you want to speak about what those acronyms are.
Yeah, so before the call started, I was sharing that the Celtic community made a fishers co-op, and we're using that fishing co-op as our kelp harvesters co-op as well model. And so the co-op is being led by Celtic Climate Action. That's the Celtic Climate Action Team, that's HCAT. And then the Celtic Integrated Resource Management Department would be responsible for like managing and regulating and looking at all of those license guided by our GWI laws, because, when I think of like our resource management is so different because a steward, even a stewardship, a steward manages something for someone else, but Celtic people are in that reciprocal relationship with our entire Wahweasau, our whole territory, including our kelp relatives. And like there's those really deep teachings around like if we take care of the kelp will take care of us. So HERMD, our management department, will play a role in like licensing and management and monitoring of the health, which they already do as we move into kelp gardening, and the co-op piece, the like economic fishing piece, and will be led by Celtic Climate Action.
Super
That's
exciting. That's really cool. Thanks, Isla.
definitely exciting. Like I said, I'm going to follow up on that because I think that there's so much potential for Indigenous communities and cooperative models. That's a webinar for another day. So over to the audience, if anybody has any questions, put your hand up, and then I'd like to also offer some space for you, Craig, if you have any questions for the panelists, something you want to explore a little bit more, or just share as a closing out.
Mhm.
I don't see any hands up. Oh, there we have Cole.
Amazing. Just want to say thank you. Really kind of expanding my mind on seaweed. It's something I'd never thought of before. I'm an Indigenous Relations Specialist at Farm Credit Canada, based out of Treaty 6 territory, just south of Edmonton in Leduc, Alberta. I wanted to actually circle back to the question around barriers to traditional harvesting. So I'm curious, like what sort of legislation is applying there, that's preventing that sales? Like, is it similar to sort of traditional harvesting laws under the Indian Act, where you can't, sell your moose meat when you're hunting and that sort of thing? Or I'm just curious where that's coming from and if there's like advocacy to make those changes.
Yeah, it's exactly like the hunting regulations. So you can't harvest and sell commercially. So the same way when you harvest and sell, it's like berries, mushrooms, all of those things. Like it's a regulated space. So like especially in the quantities that we can trade. So food, social, ceremonial, like Section 35 rights, right? So you can use it for food, social, ceremonial, including trade among nations. And so we do trade like. And so I'm going to put a little bit of scale. Like, me and my sister will go out in one tide and harvest 70 to 90 pounds of seaweed. And that's like one harvest, and there'll be multiple harvests, and that's only two people. And then like we need to dry it and all of these things. And then we trade for things that we need from neighboring nations. Like, but we can't trade for money. And I mean, this gray market exists as with like hunting and other things where some people don't have anything to trade. And so they're trading money. But, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, which luckily does not regulate kelp and seaweed, it's actually provincially done here in BC, uh, really frowns on us selling food fish. And so seaweed is treated the same way, but is regulated by BC, by the province. And so this regulation piece is a barrier for Indigenous folks to be able to make a living from traditional harvests. And whether that's fish or seaweed, it impacts us in the same way.
I can add to that as well. Um, I think another like layer of that challenge is that if, for example, someone from Isla's community wanted to get a wild harvesting permit from the province, it's all done through our Ministry of Wildlife, Lands, and Resource Stewardship.
Yeah,
Anyway,
water
sorry, I'm not.
lands. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Um, it's a very long process and it's a very convoluted process, and it often doesn't end in the person who wants to do the wild harvesting necessarily having the permit to harvest what could be ecologically viable for that particular place. So there's a lot to be done on the regulatory side, both in terms of the what's allowed in for the First Nations and their like what's considered trade and what have you, but then also if people want to apply for like the provincial permit, across the board, it's gray and complicated.
I'm just gonna jump in there for half a second. So I agree. I would just say my word for 2025 in the regulatory space is complex. And so we have a very good sense of British Columbia, really across uh, some of the other coastal provinces. So in Newfoundland, there is no formal, they're working on it, but there's actually not a license in place. There's seaweed farms in Newfoundland, but they're all research farms. New Brunswick's kind of the Wild West. They're working on some of those things. Nova Scotia's, Quebec's structured in the north and there. But I want to speak to your advocacy question. Part of what we're trying to do by bringing everybody together is that we believe federally, and we're working on some of those pieces with some of the partners here on this call, is starting some of those conversations. And a little interesting for you, Cole, is from the farm credit guy, Cascadia Seaweed, which is a British Columbia-based company, actually has, to the best of our knowledge, the first one, and certainly in Canada, but has a traditional line of credit through Farm Credit Canada, which was a monumental task just to get done. I'm sure that's over and above the regulatory piece, but all of those things are, it's key that we're all showing up as kind of a unified front to try and streamline those processes, make it more efficient. I would say, at the risk of maybe being unpopular, I mean, it's we don't disagree with the regulatory piece from the standpoint of, we're not going to introduce invasive species and do all of that. We get that. Where it's very frustrating is the current government capacity to get through and accelerate some of these things. So where we want to get going in a timely fashion, that's a gap for sure.
Amazing. Craig, do you have a minute? You want a minute or?
Sure, I'll just mention, firstly, I want to thank all the guests for being here today. And Mark, I think you really hit the nail on the head there by saying that it's important to have these conversations and to bring in different perspectives. And there's a lot of strength in building appropriate uh, sectoral plans and research plans that reflect those different opinions and perspectives. So I think that this is moving along in a very good way, and we're we will be planning other roundtables on the East Coast, and then back in May and with Rihanna and her group, and we'll continue this on for another little while. But great opportunities ahead, and I just think that it's a fascinating subject as well as opportunity here.
For sure. Well, thank you. I have a couple of things before we wrap. I'll be really quick. We have 2 minutes left. So just wanted to, we can jump to the last slides, Morgan. So what's next? We are actually hosting our own summit. So Luminary is hosting the Indigenous Innovation Summit that will be co-hosted with McGill University and Desautels Faculty of Management. That's taking place September 22nd to the 24th. So if you want to put that into your calendar, more information will be coming out about that in a big way early in the new year. Also invite you to follow us on LinkedIn. So we are under Luminary Network. You'll be able to see all of our panelists on our Luminary Network. If you want to connect and keep the conversation going, if you have more questions for them, please follow us and connect with them through that. On our website, luminary.works, we also have our 2024-2025 Luminary Annual Report. If you're curious about the work that we're doing over here and want to become engaged, visit our website to learn more. And the QR code on the corner of the screen will actually bring you to the website. We're sophisticated like that. We have that technology here now. And then, last but not least, I'd like to wish all of you a happy holidays from the team here at Luminary and thank our panelists for joining us today. I will go to the next slide that is actually a QR code for a questionnaire. If you can just take a moment, it's completely anonymous, but we do, as part of our commitment to our funder, have to collect a little bit of data. So there's two questions. One of them is if your knowledge has been enhanced by listening to this wonderful presentation today. And then we'll flip over to the question number two, which is an EDI question. So if you have a minute to answer those for us, it would be greatly appreciated. And I'll leave those up for a minute before we close. We've got a couple of seconds left. And hopefully everybody's able to pull that up with their phone. I know technology nowadays is great, but it also can be a challenge. So I will go to the next question, which is on the EDI, and I'll leave that there for you all. And with that, best wishes, Happy New Year, lots of health and wealth for the holiday season. Hope everybody's safe, and it's really great to be with you today, and we will see you in the new year. Namoltas.
Bye,
Happy
everyone.
holidays, everyone.